one of the reasons that I got started working within this sphere is because it turns out that the bond between modern art and light was especially close in France. And again, certain examples will pop directly into mind. Number one, perhaps the most obvious, is a medium called photography, which arose and was patented and elaborated in the 19th century, the light-dependent art, right, par excellence. And a lot of innovative and now rather widely celebrated forms of landscape painting, right? Art dependent upon the flux of natural light and so forth, namely impressionist landscape painting, but other forms of outdoor plein air landscape painting as well. Now, one of the things that I got interested in doing was separating light from lighting. In English, it's hard because these things kind of belong to the same word family and sort of merge into one another. In French, the distinction can be sharper because light is lumière and lighting is éclairage. And I also want to say just two more things before I dig into the artworks, properly speaking, that it turns out that it was exactly in the later years of the 19th century where one had, headquartered in Paris, a lot of world-changing experiments in the devising of new artificial lighting technologies. And it was exactly in this era of the acceleration of the competition between artificial light and natural light that it turns out a lot of surprising artworks came into being, both embracing new lights, rejecting new lights, disavowing new lights, and so forth. One final introductory remark, a lot of you know, of course you do, that even to this day, Paris is known as the city of light. And you encounter sort of mistaken ideas about this constantly. Paris was called the city of light. It would have been nice, it would have worked to my benefit if Paris came to be called the city of light because of its burgeoning presence of artificial lighting technologies. But Paris was first called the city of light in the 18th century. Yes, it was a metaphor. It was the era of, here it comes, the Enlightenment. But gradually, bit by bit, without anyone really planning it or controlling it, during the first decades of the rise of the presence of public artificial lighting technologies, the city of light, starting in like the 1840s and 1850s, did end up being associated with artificial light and not the metaphor of enlightenment. So a number of factors sort of congeal and combine, and let me use a fancy word, concatenate, when you're talking about art making in the modern era in Paris. Given the circumstances that we all have been living through, the relationship between sociability, having fun, especially nightlife, and lighting has been made especially plain to us. And one of the movies that my husband and I ended up screening since we've been in a sort of more or less shelter-in-place mode, was the Blue Dahlia, a great Raymond Chandler thriller set in Los Angeles. Veronica Lake looks out her window and says, "It takes a lot of lights to make a city, doesn't it?" And that's a question that we might be asking ourselves every day. Whatever happened to, when will they ever come back? When will we be surrounded by, when will our lives be shaped by night lights again, which would herald the return of social life as we used to enjoy it? Now, another sort of semi-introductory thing that I want to say Actually, I'm using a rather recent artwork in order to make my point, because it turns out that a lot of living artists have, I'm not saying that they took their cue from artists working in Paris in the 1800s, but they have also very powerfully realized the extremely complicated relationship between lighting and visibility, between illumination and improved seeing and or blindness. This fantastic photograph, which is a Cibachrome light box made by Jeff Wall, as you can see, there's a typo there, it was made between 1999 and 2001, was based upon a particular scenario. I'm sure a lot of you read Ralph Ellison's celebrated book, The Invisible Man. And his lightbox photo worked from Ellison's narrative by staging the conjunction of an impossible array of artificial lights and the still socially invisible Black protagonist. So 369 connected light bulbs in a basement. The Invisible Man seeks to confirm his presence, or at least to illuminate his being, but as he added more and more lights, in spite the intense glow of the lamps, he remains unseen in his below ground New York cellar lair. So you might say the takeaway, and this you'll see also reflected in a lot of earlier artworks, the motto appears to be, the more we are illuminated, the blinder we are. So I thought Jeff Wall's complicated rumination would be a good place to start. And to just show you, I thought it might be worthwhile to show you another fascinating work whose point of departure was another sort of iteration of artificial light, is this canvas by Sonia Delaney-Turk titled Electric Prisms. Now, why is this here in my talk? I wanted to present it because this canvas and others she did that year in Paris, she was an expat Russian, is often reckoned to be one of the points of the invention of geometric abstraction in art. Okay, fair enough. But the thing that I learned when my project was first underway is that she, her famous husband artist, and their friends in 1913, living in Paris, of an evening, what they did after dinner is they went and took a walk on the boulevard to go and look at the newly installed incandescent streetlights. And in her memoir, she says it was the dazzling, sort of multicolored, pulsating effect of incandescent streetlight that actually lay at the root of the invention of her geometric abstraction. So that's another, surprising connection between artificial illumination and aesthetic form. So just one quotation from one of the many historians of illumination who were busily publishing work in these years. It takes me right into the heart of the matter. Henri Maréchal declared, granted that the art of lighting cannot be the monopoly of any country or capital, it is certain that it owes its development principally to Paris. And in fact, for a brief time, because so much inventive activity and talk were headquartered in Paris, very fleetingly, in fact, I can tell you exactly the year, 1881, Paris was baptized by many experts as the electric capital, because for the first time anywhere on Earth, there was an international exposition of electricity, and Paris was considered to be the spot. Believe me, this designation did not last for long. Very shortly after that fair, it was certainly Berlin and then other cities that had a great deal more of electric light. In fact, here comes the first advertisement for my recent book. Here's the cover of my book, Illuminated Paris, Essays on Art and Lighting in the Belle Époque, or rather roughly between, right, about 1870 and the beginning of the First World War. As I became more and more familiar with the emergence and the energetic conversation around lights, mostly arguments, disputes, fights about whether more lighting was good or bad, whether it fostered increased visibility or pain and blindness, the more I immersed myself in this conversation, which I ended up baptizing Illumination Discourse, the more I realized that what I set out to do when I started was not quite what I was going to be able to do. I thought I was going to tell the story of the rise of electric illumination and the eclipse and decline and disappearance of gaslight, and the story of the artworks and art practices that somehow were entangled with that battle and that eventual triumph. Guess what? That's not what happened. In fact, electric light made very brief and strange and dramatic and controversial incursions into the atmosphere of the city. And in fact, by the end of this period, gaslight was still absolutely superior. Some of you might know that the last gaslight in Paris went dark in the 1960s. It lasted for a long time. A lot of people who work on modernity in Paris in these years, Paris has long since been baptized, controversially for some, the capital of the 19th century. A lot of historians talk about the contrast, the oscillation between dark and new kinds of lights as being the primary basis of the visual spectacle of life in Paris. So anyway, so I began immersing myself in these questions, these issues, these artworks. And here's really the place where the project started that became this book. I'm sure I'm not the only one, but certainly in my case, when I start working on a project, it always begins with questions that arise for me about artworks, that I look at artworks and discover things in them that I hadn't thought about before and that I thought needed to be answered. I encountered both of these rather small scale paintings in Chicago very early in the 21st century. At left, Charles Courtney Curran's small but extremely interesting canvas, Paris at Night, 1889, belongs to the Terra Foundation, and it used to live in Chicago. And I first saw it in a storeroom in Chicago. And maybe the painting on the right is a little more familiar, more celebrated by this Dutch guy, Vincent van Gogh, Van Gogh, The Starry Night Over the Rhone, 1888. I saw it for the first time in Chicago as well. I don't know who you are out there, but maybe some of you saw that amazing exhibition, The Studio of the South, that was at the Art Institute of Chicago in 2001. Anyway, I began sort of investigating what on earth was going on in these pictures. Significantly, both of these artists were not what I call indigenous modernists. They both came from elsewhere and brought a perspective of elsewhere onto what they were looking at. In the case of Charles Courtney Curran's little picture, it was so striking. And I can assure you there's no painting by a Paris-born artist that looks like this. The way in which he managed to capture such a wide range of illumination technologies all in one picture. So he's got oil light, he's got gas light, he's got moonlight, and he has oil light inside apartments as well. And he also has the light glowing out of what was called a Morris column that you see all the way over to the left. One of the things that I found striking about the picture is that he went out of his way to include all these varied points of light, but oddly enough, the painting is not illuminated. The painting is very much dark. It remains so dark despite all of its points of illumination. And I also began to ask questions about why Americans painted Paris at night and the French didn't, and why when Americans did paint Paris at night, I call them outsider nocturnes, sociability was rather friendly and without friction. So nighttime was a time of concord and sociability in this kind of picture. Okay, so what was interesting about the Van Gogh? Well, you know, for a very long time, people had talked about this picture. Obviously, it's a nighttime picture. There's a big expanse of the Rhone River down in Provence. This is actually set between Arles and a little town across the way, Trinquetaille. And when you first look at it, and when others had looked at it previously, it looked as though it was a record of the stars in the sky that make up, yes, indeed, the Big Dipper. It looked as though the primary stars in the Big Dipper received their rather dramatic yellow, sort of triangular reflected patterns in the water. Well, maybe that holds if you look at it in a hurry, but if you spend more time looking at this picture, you know what you actually find is you find that those very saturated, bright, wiggly, striated patterns of reflected light on the surface of the glassy blue Rhone, those are actually reflections of the gas lights, the new gas lights, the new networked gas lights that were recently installed in Arles. Arles was hot foot in pursuit of technologized modernity and had an extremely expansive network of light. And so, in fact, what Van Gogh is doing is he's actually staging the picture as a contest between two different kinds of illumination, celestial light and artificial light. And if in fact it's a contest, you can see there's not much doubt about which form wins. It's the gas light that wins in the sense of the amount of paint on the canvas and the brightness of the strokes. So I began asking myself, why on earth would an artist like Van Gogh be interested in staging a competition between gaslight and starlight in a painting like this? So the plot began to thicken. And sure enough, it didn't take too much poking around to discover in this era, as I've already said, of illumination discourse, all of a sudden, really like overnight. Well, we have similar things happening in our world now, apropos of certain technologies, especially video game shares in the stock market. There grew up overnight a lot of new technical newspapers and journals, some of them with a fairly broad popular audience. And one of them, I'm showing you one page from La Lumière Électrique, Journal Universel d'Électricité, the electric light, Universal Journal of Electricity. And what it shows us, it's a wood engraving used as an illustration in an issue in 1881, but it's of something that happened in 1878. Why am I showing it to you? Because it shows one of the most dramatic things that happened in the city of Paris in those years, the arrival, thanks to the city council, it was the city council's idea, the arrival on the street without warning of a network of a new kind of light, a carbon arc light that ended up being called, as you can see in the French caption there, Yablokov lamps, because they were invented and perfected by an expatriated Russian engineer, Yablokov. And as you can see, the way in which they're captured in the wood engraving, it's as though they're just incredibly bright, uninflected white globes. And the conversation that took place in Paris in and around these electric arc lamps, I assure you, Parisians just could not shut up about arc lamps and what they had contributed to the cityscape for good and for evil. Okay, so there's all this conversation going on about various new kinds of street lights, night lights. And so you think, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll look at some of the most familiar examples of cityscapes done by card-carrying members of a group that a lot of people know something about, the Impressionist group. And one of them, I decided I would pick one that was fairly well known in Chicago. Remember when we used to be able to go to the art museum and look at things? Gustav Kliment's Rainy Day. Yeah, the picture in the middle includes me. It's not as much about vanity as things. I thought it would be handy to include this because you can see the scale of the picture, that the couple walking in the foreground are pretty close to life size. It's a very large picture. Anyway, but what interests me today, and for my purposes today, is to point out to you that sizable, indeed enormous, full-length, unlit gas lamp right in the middle of the painting. You can see in the detail that I've included over there on the right, the way in which the actual lantern of the lamp is opaque. It can't be seen through, but the thing that I want to highlight is that this painting is in many ways, this famous painting, much written about, is in many ways structured around an unlit gas lamp. So questions automatically arise. Why, what's the great interest in lighting infrastructure represented in the daytime? Why not have shown it at work in the nighttime? Why show it when it is in fact sort of asleep and not yet on the job? So that leads in again to that question that I already raised of why these artists who were called the painters of modern life, who did most of their work, lots of their work within the cityscape of the dynamically changing Paris, why is there not even one Paris nocturne by members of this group? I can't see when this changes. There we go. So let me show you another example of a kind of response to so do you want both the Paris twilight, both illuminated naturally and artificially. This is one of the most subtle and one of the most compelling. This is a work by another expat artist. This is John Singer Sargent, a man who actually had, as it were, an American passport, but who lived almost his entire life out of the country, most of it in France. This is one of two paintings he set in the Luxembourg Gardens in central Paris at twilight. This is the time of day that the French call l'heure bleue, the blue hour, which is a sort of an evocative term for twilight. What you see in the background, this has been mistaken many times for sunset. No, my friends, this is moonrise. You have to look at the map and you discover that it's facing in the direction of moonrise. So this is such a fascinating story, the story of this painting, because as I was beginning to track the placement of these new kinds of brash, much disputed kinds of lighting fixtures in the city, I discovered, I couldn't believe my eyes, I discovered that the summer that Sargent was working out there on this picture directly through those green trees, where you can actually see orangey balls of gaslight through the opening. That very summer, the city put a network of Yablokov carbon arc lamps right up the street that would have been visible through the trees. So the plot thickens. You think, why was Sargent attracted to this location at this moment when the brash light may have sort of disturbed his project, but he carried on? So you see, you've got reflected moonlight on the boat basin, right? I've already pointed out points of gaslight that you can see through the trees. We already know that we have that pale natural light of twilight. And you could also see, if you made a trip to Philadelphia, that there's also the red cigarette end on the swell guy who's walking across the gardens with the woman in the, by the way, very unfashionable pink dress. So he's made it a project for himself to find a way to portray this very subtle moment of twilight, including a variety of lights. And then you look some more and you think, why is there so much pigment on that boat basin? Isn't all that thick, pale yellow pigment really too much to record moonlight? And then you begin to ask some more questions. And one of the things that allows you to ask the questions is the discovery that a lot of caricaturists were also taking up questions of competing lights in the city in those years. And I must say, another great day researching the day I found this. The date that's on this is incorrect. The caricaturist whose pseudonym was Sham actually was dead by 1880. So we know this was done. Yeah, you have to be an art historian to know that artworks are actually done by people before they're dead. Anyway, but the caption on this, this rather winning little caricature of the moon, there she is smiling. She's got a fancy dress on. She has a paintbrush pointed up toward her face, and she's holding a little bucket of silver solution. And the caption says, "The moon resilvering herself in order to appear more brilliant than the light of Mr. Yablokov." So this is a caricature that takes up exactly the theme that's addressed in Sargent's painting. In some ways, once you see this caricature, actually, I'm gonna go back one. Once you see this caricature, you can see Sargent's picture through that lens and think, Sargent has actually made a picture that is a brief on behalf of moonlight. He's exaggerated the moonlight in order to push back against these other lights, shocking the eyes and disrupting the tranquility of the gardens at night. And in fact, I came around to arguing that the extra pigment denoting reflection on the boat basin was actually, could be seen as the displaced, shifted over, deferred rays of those Yablokov lights. Anyway, enough said about it, but this is an extremely complicated and wonderful picture for people interested in relationships between ambitious art making and lights and lighting in these years. And sure enough, the whole question of how caricature is functioning right now in the 21st century, that's an interesting topic for another day. But the extremely important function played by caricature that mostly appeared in illustrated journals in these years, the arrival on the scene of controversial forms of artificial light ended up providing topics for caricaturists that made the whole theme sort of unstoppable. Over on the left, my favorite artist, Sham again. Here we are underneath clusters of those nasty arc lights right in front of the opera. And you can see these people are using umbrellas at night, an umbrella in the evening in order to cross the place, the space in front of the opera. And you can see the charm really exaggerates. It's as though they're walking through a storm. It's as though they're walking down the street right now in a snowstorm, underscoring this increasing reputation that ArcLight had as being not just bright, but blinding and very bad for your eyes. In fact, this was a very good era for eye doctors because a lot of people were persuaded that they were losing their sight because of these lights. Over on the right, in a hurry here, this is a special issue of a journal called Caricature that was dedicated to something I mentioned a moment ago, the first ever exposition of electricity, the International Exposition of Electricity, which indeed was held in a building that had been constructed for a World's Fair in 1855, the Palace of Industry, and it had right in the center of it a small scale lighthouse, as you see in this collection of jokes. Let me just, yeah, I'll use the word, let me just illuminate a couple of them for you. In the upper right, where you see a red triangle, a joke is made here thanks to the red tone of the light coming out of one panel of the cupola on the lighthouse. The guy with the bowler hat and the beard reaches over to his friend, a rather sort of upright bourgeois in a fancy hat. And the energetic guy with the beard says, "I knew it. I just knew the day would come. I would live long enough to see you become red." Yeah, so it's a sort of a fantasy about electric light of a certain tone can actually produce people who move to the left side of the political chart. There are all kinds of jokes down. This is maybe ends up being a not entirely attractive theme that's all over the place in caricatures from these periods. Constantly talking about glaring electric light as a new kind of alibi, that men found themselves grabbing women and poking women and then saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I couldn't see you there, I was blinded by the light." And one of my favorites is down below in the middle of the caricature. There's a sort of forlorn guy with a cane and a beaten up top hat saying, "Please have pity on me. I spent so much time, basically I spent so much time studying artificial illumination, I've gone blind." So that's kind of the art historian who gets too involved in these things. Now, another whole sort of line of investigation here that I pursued, and in fact, this is what got me started taking printmaking classes at Evanston Art Center, is that this just during the years that everybody is arguing and shouting about these new competing forms of artificial illumination, this is exactly the moment when a particular quartet of ambitious artists threw themselves into printmaking. In fact, into intaglio printmaking, and all of their prints were printed in black and white, no color prints whatsoever. You see one by Mary Cassatt here and one by Edgar Degas, two of the most important practitioners here. And one of the reasons that they got involved in doing this, they were all painters as well, is that they were going to start a journal called Day and Night, Le Jour et la Nuit. And so they were madly etching plates and making impressions, thinking that they could be assembled in a journal. The journal finally didn't happen. It collapsed beneath the weight of its own contradictions because they realized that you couldn't have commercially printed one-of-a-kind intaglio prints. But the thing that interested me was just at the time when Paris is completely in the grip of arguments about lighting, they end up not only including various light fixtures in their prints, but throwing themselves into a medium, into a form of art that was 100% about the negotiation of darks and lights, of brights and dim areas. So I think that it's not hard to make a case that prints like these are in some ways brought into being for their own aesthetic reasons, but also as various kind of records of responses to the lighting environment out in the street. That's, yeah. Degas worked in lithography as well, and I thought I would throw this in because it actually shows the way in which Degas and others associated a variety, a competition, the simultaneous presence of multiple lights and lighting technologies as a defining aspect, not just of Paris nightlife, but of modernity, of modern experience itself. And here he really goes out of his way. He's got, he has gas light, he has an arc light, he has an oil light chandelier, and you can see those little pale striations in the background. Fireworks are being exploded, and all the way the cloudy bit on the right in the background is in fact the moon covered by clouds. So here's a great example of the embeddedness of certain ways of imagining the world in this sort of universe of competing lights. Oh, this is the Curran back again. I thought it was worth, we probably don't need to see it again. I just wanted to make the case that what Curran is doing here, it just, yeah, I guess what I want to say is it would be completely unintelligible without knowing that the city was completely awash in conversations and arguments about lighting. Oh, and this is a place to say, as we see these extremely pale emanations of no doubt oil light in the apartments that you can see in the background, one of the most effective forces against electric light in the domestic sphere, against the electrification of actual private interiors, one of the sort of bulwarks against the electrification of the interior, what constituted by the opinions of well-to-do upper-class women. Upper-class women gave speeches about it, wrote in newspapers, because they knew then what we still know now: electric light makes us look terrible. And they were determined to keep it out. As a famous historian of the night, a French scholar, Simon Delattre, says, the bourgeois nest prefers the flame. And I always think of that every time, I know back in normal life when we used to have company for dinner, that, we were always running around lighting candles and turning down the other lights. The bourgeois nest continues to prefer the flame. Now, this is one of the last works that I take up in this book of mine, an extremely challenging picture for many reasons. This is a work done by, you've heard his name, the extremely celebrated Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, very cosmopolitan. He worked in many places across Scandinavia and Western Europe. When he was a very young man, he had a fellowship from the Norwegian government to study art in Paris. This is one of the pictures he did from the apartment he rented a good deal out of town, west of the city in Saint Cloud, Night in Saint Cloud. Munch was an artist who, once he settled on a composition, on a theme, he would repeat it in various media. So we have paintings and prints and drawings and so forth that refer to this extraordinary scenario: a solitary man up against the window as night lights and moonlight, various kinds of lights, pour in through the window into his space. We can't see anything about him. He's alone. He's absorbed. He seems to be absorbed by the spectacle out the window. He has a top hat on, so he's dressed to go outside, but he's sequestered in the interior. He's both looking at the lights out the window and making sure that he stays well away from them. And something that just came to light very, very recently, within the last couple of months, a recent review of my book by a very smart art historian named Martin Young. I knew that Edvard Munch had moved out there in '89 to get away from an outbreak of the flu, but it turns out that it actually qualified as one of the first modern pandemics. And we're actually looking at someone who is sheltering in place during a pandemic. And Martin Young also discovered, this is something I didn't know, that a lot of people thought that the cause of this virus was electricity. So this is a picture which really resonates both in terms of its own circumstances and in terms of those we're negotiating today. One more thing about this picture. A couple of years ago, and against all odds, I was invited to give a lecture at a big conference on Edvard Munch's art that was given in Oslo. So there I was in Oslo in this huge auditorium talking about Edvard Munch. And everybody in the auditorium, everybody who's ever worked on Munch, and that's a lot of people, we're all there. And after I gave my lecture, including quite a long discussion of this painting, I was introduced to the most senior, the most towering historian of the art of Edvard Munch. I curtsied, I was very polite. And he said to me, I can't quite imitate his voice, but he said to me, do you know what that man is looking at out the window? Well, I wanted to say I just spent 45 minutes talking about what I thought. And I said, no, sir, I guess I don't know what he's looking at out the window. He said, well, he's obviously looking at the illuminated Eiffel Tower. Well, stranger things have happened, but once he made that claim, that was the beginning of the project that I'm working on now, the big research project on the illuminated Eiffel Tower, its appearance, its engineering, its reception, its impact. This project, the inescapability of the Eiffel Tower. It all began because somebody made a sort of critical remark about something I'd said about Edvard Munch. Okay, here comes my last picture. So when I started really working, on, art made in Paris and artificial illumination, everybody said, well, so what do you have to say about Toulouse-Lautrec? Because everyone thought, I mean, you don't have to be an expert in anything to have, everybody knows, everybody has some familiarity with the work of Toulouse-Lautrec. So, well, to make a long story short, this was part of my sort of confessional about how I started out to write a book about the rise of electric light and its impact on visual art practices, and discovered instead patterns of avoidance and disavowal of very short-lived electric light technologies and the continuation of the dominion, blah, 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 of gaslight. And it turned out that even in amazingly, there's the dimension, 74 by 45 inches. It's an enormous poster. Even a brash, highly effective advertising poster like this one by Toulouse-Lautrec, guess what? All those light fixtures in the Moulin Rouge, that's all gaslight, not one electric light at all. So I decided that Toulouse-Lautrec was not going to be part of my story. So in fact, I ended up not talking about Toulouse-Lautrec. So that's a confession. And the last thing, don't worry, here's the last thing. You can't see it? I apologize, this is somewhat ridiculous. The way I formatted my slides in my PowerPoint can't be seen by this projection system. So in fact, what was on this screen, the University of Chicago Press, who published this book of mine, I asked them and they very kindly complied. They generated a discount code just for you, a code that you could use just in case you wanted to buy the book from the University of Chicago Press website. And it's a code that gives you 20% off, and it's good until the end of February. So I'll ask the good people at the Evanston Arts Center to find a way to share this with you, should you want to use it. Okay, the end. Now, I'm very happy to answer questions. And even in this multiple technological environment here, I know that the questions you've asked can be conveyed to me. Ashley, do you want to do that? Or should I just not be?
You can answer and give any questions in the chat function and I'll read them out.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anyone now want to follow up with putting some questions into the chat function? Oh, here's a question. Should I just go ahead? here's a question from someone named Richard Stump. Did I do any research on Brassai? Well, there's the short answer and there's the long, windy answer. Because I decided that two things. Nocturnal photography was not technologically possible until 1895, which was rather far down the pike for the slice of years I was studying. I didn't study nocturnal photography, and I also made the case that Brassai and others who photographed, who were known as the photographers of Paris at night, have been studied really well and really in really impressive detail. So the answer is no, and that's why I didn't. Oh, so here's a question about arc lights. Yeah, so do I have an idea of how bright the arc lights were in comparison to modern street lamps or the color temperature? Thanks for that really good question. One of the things that was right at the center of the debate at the time was that the shocking thing about arc lights is that the light was pure white, as opposed to what was much more familiar, the sort of wavery yellow gas flames of gas lamps. So there was a lot of talk about the actual, I'm not quite sure how it was calibrated, but there was a lot of talk about the impossible brightness of arc lights, that they actually exceeded the optical abilities of human eyes to be present and stare at them. I don't have the exact numbers, but they were certainly reckoned to be a lot brighter than the eventual Edison technology incandescent streetlights that ended up being networked in Paris between the wars. So the answer is, man, really bright and very white and very troubling. In fact, if you felt that you were under assault by those arc lamps and you wanted to fight back against them, there was a big business conducted in those years in blue sunglasses. This thing that all you needed was a good blue lens and you wouldn't go blind. Anyway, I see a question here from Indira. How do gas, oil, electric, and arc lights differ? Well, it's a question, isn't it? I mean, first of all, it's a question of flame lights as opposed to lights that are caused by filaments. And arc lights were called arc lights because the light was actually created by a very closely, indeed parallel alignment of two carbon rods, and a spark was ignited that actually burned between the two carbon rods until they were extinguished. And in fact, that was another one of the problems with electric arc lights. They weren't very stable because as soon as the two carbon rods burned down, somebody had to climb up there and replace them. So the difference in the sort of the stability of the lights, the color of the lights, and the relative ferocity of the lights. David Rickert says, in the center top of the window in Saint-Cloud, there's a hanging lamp, not a laminate. Oh, thank you for asking. It's a very particular kind of kerosene lamp. It's the kind of lamp that we in the United States ended up calling a library lamp. It's very striking that the place that Munch put it in the picture, it's actually so low that he would have bumped his head on it if he stood up. So I mean, Munch was not a lighting engineer, but the large presence of that light and it's not being turned on helps to create that sort of moody gray darkness of that interior away from the lights of the city. That's the best I can do right now. In the book, here's another ad for my book. In the book, I don't remember now, I talk about that lamp for about 4 pages. So I used to know more about it than I remember now. Oh, Priscilla, privately. Oh. The reflection of the lamp on the floor. One of the things that's so interesting about what you do see in the Munch is that you see an enormous presence of the crisscross shadow of the actual frame of the window, of the closed window. And because of its prominence in the room and where it actually lands on the furniture, it's not hard to make you to think that it actually resembles a catafalque, as though there's something as sort of unhinging as a sarcophagus or some kind of such death structure in the room. But there is no shadow cast by the hanging lamp in the room, right? Oh, from Quaid. Had directional light been developed by the end of the Belle Epoque? And if so, was that ever used for studio lighting for portraits or painting in general? Quaid, by directional light, I take it you mean light that could actually be shifted and moved and targeted on the subject. The short answer is yes, because most studio lighting in the years that concerned me, most artists who worked in studios at home or indoors had gas light in their interiors, and there was a way in which there could be a kind of metal flappy frame put around them and have the fixture be mobile, and the flaps around it could actually direct the light. We know, for example, such a thing was used as early as Zero Day in the 1790s. Thank you for all these excellent detailed questions. It really, I like to claim that while I was working on this project, I became a world-class lamp nerd, but that I can't quite answer those technical questions at the drop of a hat shows that I guess I was what, a lamp nerdette. I wasn't all the way up in the varsity of the international lamp enthusiasts. I'm looking at the wonderful people in charge here in the Evanston Art Center. Do you think that the polite thing now would be to say, thank you so much for being present and goodbye? Yeah, okay, I'm being given the thumbs up. This is one of the most complicated sort of spatial technological lecture situations I've ever been in. The little thing on the bottom tells me that there actually are participants out there, and now I know who some of you are, thanks to the authorship of the questions. Thanks a lot for spending a part of your afternoon with me. And I will have the temerity to make sure that the discount code for this book is sent your way. Right? Okay. All right. Goodbye, and thanks very much.